In a city where every corner pulses with the heartbeat of 1,000 stories, one girl moved through the chaos like forgotten wind. Her footsteps made no sound. Her name? Erased by time. She wasn't born on the streets, no one is. But by the time the world remembered her, she was already hardened by it. She lived not in homes but in cracks between buildings, beneath bridges, beside markets. She slept curled beneath broken signposts, using discarded cartons as blankets, her dreams echoing with silence. Each day she woke to nothing, and each night she went to sleep with less than that. No name, no papers, no people. But she had something. A stare that pierced through noise, eyes that seemed older than the city itself, and a scar on her shoulder, faint, shaped like an ancestral mark. But no one ever noticed, because no one ever looked long enough. Miles away, the world belonged to another man entirely. A man named Dammy who never tasted hunger, never slept without air conditioning, never begged, and never feared tomorrow. Dammy was one of the wealthiest men in West Africa. Young, brilliant, and cold as steel. They said he inherited wealth, but they were wrong. He inherited power. Wealth followed him like dust follows wind. He lived in the clouds, literally. His penthouse overlooked the sea, his staff answered to his silence, and his business empire stretched beyond borders. But beneath the shine, Dammy was tired. Not of money, not of power, but of absence. He had everything, yet it meant nothing. His laugh was a rumor. His joy was a transaction. His mother once told him, "The heart is the only empire you must conquer last." But he had forgotten that. It was a Thursday. Rain kissed the streets like morning. The city was gray. People ran under umbrellas, honking in frustration, rushing to nowhere. She stood outside a supermarket in Ikoyi, not to beg, not to steal, just to feel warm air leak from its automatic doors. People walked past her as though she was part of the wall. Some tightened their bags, others scoffed, but she stood still, soaked, silent, skeletal. Dammy's car pulled up, a black Maybach with tinted glass. Inside, he read reports about foreign stock markets. He wasn't meant to be there, but a meeting had been canceled. Hunger sent him out personally for sushi. He stepped out, suit sharp, wrist heavy with a gold watch. That's when he saw her, not as a beggar, not as a street nuisance, but as a question. Her eyes met his for a second. In them he saw something that shattered him. Loneliness, but not the kind born from lack, the kind born from exile. She turned away, but Dammy did not. For the first time in years, his feet disobeyed logic. He walked to her, removed his blazer, and placed it around her shoulders. She looked at him, not in gratitude, not in surprise, but in confusion. He handed her a food box, hot, wrapped in banana leaves. She took it. Still no words. The moment was beyond language. As he walked back to his car, something gnawed at him. He had faced billion-dollar decisions, negotiated in Dubai, New York, and Paris. But this was the hardest question he ever faced. Why did I just do that? He turned back. She was still there, eating slowly like someone unused to hot meals. He returned, offered her a ride. She hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't trust kindness. But he persisted. He didn't take her to his mansion. He took her to a guest lodge he owned nearby, used mostly by business guests. Plain, safe, humble. He gave her a key, told the caretaker to make her comfortable. She still said nothing. That night, she bathed in hot water for the first time in years, wore clean clothes, slept on a bed, under a roof, on a mattress, with a pillow. And the city watched. That night she dreamt, not of food, not of comfort, but of fire, and chains, and a woman crying in a language she didn't understand. In the dream she stood on red earth. A voice whispered, "Daughter, they buried our names, but not our seed." She awoke in tears, not fear, but knowing. Something ancient was waking inside her. You see, her bloodline was not ordinary. It came from a forgotten village, from a woman who once farmed land she did not own, who birthed daughters in the bush, who was taken, whipped, silenced. That woman cursed the earth with her dying breath. "The day my seed touches the soil of gold, let the land rise to remember me." And now, her seed had returned, through the city, through the storm, through hunger, and into the care of the man who unknowingly owned the exact land her ancestors once died on. 3 years ago, Dammy had purchased a vast abandoned farmland outside the city for real estate. It had no papers, no records, just an old oral tale of women who once died defending it. He was told it was cursed. He didn't believe in curses, only contracts. But now the girl, the beggar, was under his roof. And the land? It began to shake, not with earthquakes, but with memory. They called her homeless. They called him heartless. But the spirits called it alignment. What happens when destiny doesn't knock, but breaks the door? What if the girl you saved is the soul of the land you own? And what if your wealth was only the interest on her blood? There are places in every home that are quiet, not because no one speaks there, but because the ancestors are listening. The girl did not step into the mansion. Though she was offered everything, marble floors, velvet curtains, a room with gold leaf ceilings, she chose instead the old servant quarters behind the main house. It was a structure forgotten by time, covered in vines and memory. The floor was cracked, the windows fogged, the walls bore stains older than she was. Yet that's where she placed her feet. She didn't clean. She didn't complain. She simply sat, knees folded, as though she had returned home, not to luxury but to a place her spirit remembered. That night the air shifted again. The wind moved through the trees differently. The dogs didn't bark. The night didn't sing. Even the moon held its breath. Because someone, had awakened. The mansion stood tall with polished staircases and chandeliers that mimicked stars. But the silence from the back room, the girl's room, carried more power than the entire estate. The billionaire, though used to controlling markets and minds, found his attention drawn toward her quarters every night. He couldn't explain it. She asked for nothing. Yet her presence was commanding. She didn't touch anything. Yet her energy began to cleanse everything. Maids noticed first. Fresh flowers lasted longer near her door. The walls no longer cracked from rain. The rats that had plagued the back house vanished. Even the oldest of housekeepers whispered, "This girl is not ordinary." She wasn't. Each night, while the city danced in noise and the mansion fell into slumber, the girl would rise and sit cross-legged on the ground. And she would whisper, not to herself, not to anyone visible, but to the ones buried under her feet. She whispered to her grandmother's grandmother, to the ones who had bled in silence, to the nameless women who birthed warriors but died in chains. And they heard her, because her blood carried their grief. And her silence? It was their language. In her quiet rituals, the floorboards hummed. The wind responded with gentle sways. The night began to soften. Even the billionaire noticed that when she stayed, sleep came easier. When she left for walks, the air inside felt heavier. He started eating in silence, wondering how a girl with no shoes, no surname, and no request had disrupted the atmosphere of an empire. She was not trying to change his life. She was remembering her own. By the third week, the billionaire's mother came visiting, a woman known for her elegance and intolerance for what didn't sparkle. She stepped out of her Rolls Royce with pearls around her neck and suspicion in her eyes. And yet, the moment she walked past the servant quarters, she paused. Her knees wobbled. Tears formed for no reason. Memories she never lived began flashing. Cotton fields, crying babies, and a familiar hymn sung by unfamiliar voices. She clutched her chest and whispered, "Something is buried here." She was right. Because while the girl swept nothing, cleaned nothing, and served no tea, she was unearthing everything. The billionaire, confused by the emotional shifts in his household, hired a spiritual expert. Not a pastor, not an imam, but an old seer from the eastern villages. The man, old enough to be mistaken for a tree, entered the compound and bowed his head. He said nothing, only walked slowly, his bare feet scanning the ground like a compass. And then he stopped, right outside the girl's door. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He only whispered, "She is standing on the bones of royalty," and left. The billionaire didn't understand, but deep down he was afraid to ask, because some truths don't come in words. They come in tears, in chills, and in dreams. And dreams were about to begin. That night, for the first time in years, the billionaire dreamt. Not of boardrooms or balance sheets, but of a village he had never seen. A woman stood in the center of a burning hut, holding a child wrapped in white cloth. Behind her, colonizers with guns. Before her, a tree struck by lightning. And then, her eyes, They looked just like the beggar girls. He woke up shaking, sweating, confused, but not scared, because the dream did not frighten him. It filled him with a knowing, with a longing, with an ache that said, "There's more to your wealth than your bank account." The next morning, the girl rose early. She stepped out of the servant quarters with the same scarf, the same eyes, the same calm. But something about her posture had changed. She was no longer simply the girl who had slept under bridges. She now walked like one who had risen from graves. And though she still didn't enter the main house, the house began to revolve around her. She spoke little, ate less, slept seldom. Yet her aura expanded, softening the sharpest souls and silencing even the billionaire's arrogance. He began to notice. The stocks he had once lost were suddenly rebounding. His business competitors began falling off like leaves in harmattan. His dreams grew clearer. And for the first time in his life, he found joy in silence. And it was all tied to her. Not because she was a woman, but because she was a mirror of a past he had forgotten, and a future he didn't know he needed. Not all doors are locked with keys. Some are locked with memories. Some are sealed by pain. For weeks, she had not stepped near the mansion. She had lived behind it, within it, around it, but not inside it. Until the day she touched the steps. It was a quiet morning. The kind where the sun was hesitant to rise, and the birds seemed unsure if they should sing. The girl, wrapped in the same tattered shawl, rose before anyone else. She did not eat. She did not drink. She simply stood, facing the mansion as though it had called her. And maybe it had. The earth beneath her feet was soft, but her footsteps were heavy, as if generations were walking with her. Each stride toward the house felt like a heartbeat echoing across time. The maids noticed. The guards stood still. Even the wind froze. And when her bare feet reached the first polished marble step of the mansion's front porch, every light in the house went out. Then the power grid across the city shut down. Darkness spread. Not chaos. Not confusion. Just stillness. As if the earth itself had paused to witness what had just happened. Because when her foot touched the step, it wasn't just contact. It was recognition. The building was not just bricks and stone. It had memory. It had sorrow. It had been built with wealth made from pain. Slave-era riches. Colonial contracts. Blood-earned gold. And now, the descendant of those who had suffered beneath its shadow had arrived. Not as a servant, but as a silent sovereign. Her touch was not a demand. It was a declaration. A signal to the unseen. That the balance was shifting. And the mansion groaned. Literally. Old pipes moaned in the walls. Chandeliers trembled. Glassware cracked on the dining table. And still she stood on the step, calm, unmoved, looking straight ahead. Not trying to enter. Just being. Just existing, where her people were once forbidden to exist. And the house bowed. He had been on a business call. High towers. Big deals. Global mergers. But the moment the power went out, his call dropped. He rose from his chair and walked to the window. And there she was. One foot on his front step. One hand at her side. Eyes closed. Head lifted. And everything inside him broke. Not from fear, but from awe. He had seen women walk red carpets. He had shaken hands with presidents and kings. But nothing had ever made him tremble like the sight of a barefoot girl standing at the gates of his empire. Not begging. Not asking. Just reclaiming. And in that moment, the billionaire fell to his knees. Because though he owned the title deed, she owned the story. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. He walked the corridors of the house, listening for something. Not rats, not sounds, but whispers. And they came. Not in English, not in French, but in a language his soul remembered. Voices of women humming lullabies in the fields. Men praying under mango trees before being chained. Children laughing in dusty courtyards long swallowed by skyscrapers. He walked toward the staircase and saw her, standing at the top. The girl. But this time her shawl glowed. Not literally, but with a light that felt older than electricity. And for the first time she entered the house. Not through the main door, but through the very hallway his great-grandfather had once ordered servants to scrub with their knees. She walked slowly, each footstep echoing with justice. The chandelier above her didn't swing. It bowed. The walls didn't creak. They sighed. The floor didn't groan. It welcomed her. And then she stood in front of a painting. his family's ancestral portrait, painted over 100 years ago. And there, in the far corner of the artwork, was a face, a young girl in rags, kneeling beside a basin, scrubbing. It was her. Not literally, but unmistakably. The same eyes, the same mouth, the same quiet defiance. And the billionaire felt a knot rise in his throat. His great-grandfather hadn't just employed her ancestors. He had owned them. And now, the story had turned. The next morning, something impossible happened. Behind the servant quarters, a garden had grown. Not planted, not tended, but fully grown. Banana trees, cassava, mangoes, yam leaves, flourishing out of dry, dead soil. No one had seen it happen. No one had watered anything. But when the staff woke, it was there. And beside the tallest pawpaw tree was a small carved stool, the kind used only by priestesses and ancient queens. And the girl, she sat on it, not to declare power, but to remember pain. Because in African folklore, real queens don't wear crowns. They wear grief, and still rise. The billionaire tried to offer her everything. Bank accounts, cars, a passport to anywhere. She said nothing. Instead, she walked to a wall in the garden, an old one no one noticed, and placed her palm on it. Moments later, the wind picked up, and with it came voices, soft, mournful, triumphant, as though the earth beneath the mansion had begun to weep with joy, because she had returned, not to take, but to remember. And in remembering she reigned. Not all roots grow upward. Some dig deep into pain. Some entangle themselves around bones, guilt, and silence. And under the grand mansion, behind its white-painted walls, velvet drapes, and marble floors, was a secret too heavy to remain buried. It began with the earth trembling ever so slightly. Not a quake, not a disaster, but a murmur, a whisper from the soil, a language older than any man. And it came when the girl knelt in the garden for the first time. She was not praying. She was listening to the earth, to its sobs, to the stories beneath. And what she heard made her freeze. For under the house, beneath the cellar where wine bottles lined the walls and ancient books collected dust, lay something that should never have been forgotten. A graveyard. No tombstones, no names, no flowers, just bodies, laid in silence, stacked in shame, covered in cement. They were not buried to rest. They were hidden to be erased. The great-grandfather of the billionaire had been a man praised in newspapers. A man of vision, they said. A builder of empires, they called him. But what they never printed was that when the land was being cleared to build the mansion, his laborers, enslaved and unpaid, discovered an old slave burial ground. And to keep construction on schedule, he gave an order. Seal it, cover it, build over it. And so they did. But the dead never sleep without peace. And peace never comes to those denied dignity. That night, after she uncovered the truth, the skies turned red. Not with rain, but with dust. The wind howled through the mansion like the cries of women who once scrubbed its floors. Windows shattered, only on the east side of the house where the original slave quarters once stood. The staff ran. Lights flickered. The pipes moaned with ancient sorrow. And she stood in the garden, alone, facing the house, facing history. The billionaire came rushing down the hallway barefoot, sweat soaking his silk shirt. He found her standing at the gate of the garden, and she pointed to the ground. No words, just a look, and he understood. The next morning he didn't call the police. He didn't call priests or contractors. He called builders, not to fix, but to dig. And dig they did. What they found beneath the mansion shook the soul of the land. Dozens of bones, shackled wrists, children's ribs, women's earrings embedded in skulls. It was not just a graveyard. It was a crime scene buried by history. And he wept, not out of guilt, but out of awakening. He realized then, this mansion was never his. It had never been anyone's. It was a cage built on silence. But now the silence was broken. She didn't ask for revenge. She asked for fire. Not to destroy the mansion, but to cleanse it. And so, that night, a ceremonial pyre was built in the garden. Logs from ancestral trees, ashes of old uniforms, photographs of slave owners torn and tossed into flame. She danced around it, not with joy, but with grief. And the mansion watched. The windows flickered, the doors moaned, And the walls, those proud, perfect white walls, began to crack. Not from damage, but from release. At dawn, something strange happened. For years, birds never nested near the mansion. Not a single chirp on the roof. Not a feather in the garden. But after the fire, they returned. Hundreds of them. Weaving nests. Singing. Even the crows, birds of death, sang like sparrows. Because the land had exhaled. The story buried in bones had been spoken. And the ancestors were watching. Smiling. He tore down the wine cellar himself. With his bare hands. Brick by brick. And in its place he began to build, not a new room, not a vault, but a memorial, a shrine, a garden, a wall of names, not names from books, but names she remembered in dreams. Some real, some whispered, some felt in the bones. He didn't ask for applause. He asked for forgiveness. And forgiveness the land gave, but only after truth. When the shrine was completed, it was not open to tourists. Not announced in papers. Not shared on the Billionaire's Twitter. It was sacred. A secret known only by those who needed to heal. And on the first night she walked in, barefoot, older than her years. She held an oil lamp in her hand. And when she lit it, the room glowed with something more than light. It glowed with peace. For the first time in centuries, the land beneath the mansion stopped weeping. Not all healing begins with medicine. Some begins with silence, with sacred air, with a place that remembers and refuses to forget. After the shrine was built and the bones of the forgotten laid to rest, something began to change in the mansion. Not in the chandeliers or walls, but in the air. It became sacred, like standing in a cathedral that had no name, no preacher, no sermon, just presence. The mansion was no longer just a home. It had become a sanctuary. She began by opening the doors, not to the rich, not to politicians, not to influencers, but to the broken, to the homeless woman with the missing child, to the boy who had never seen his father's face, to the man whose grandfather vanished in the mines, to the grandmother who still dreamed in slave chains. They came one by one, each with a story, each with a wound, each carrying a silence too heavy to hold, and the house welcomed them, with open rooms, soft beds, warm meals, and no questions, because this was not a hotel, it was a womb. The girl converted one of the empty halls into what she called the Room of Echoes. It had no windows, no light bulbs, just mirrors and sound. There, the broken would sit in silence, and eventually the room would speak back, not in voices, but in memory. A man once walked in with a limp and emerged remembering the song his enslaved mother hummed while braiding his hair. A girl once entered blindfolded and walked out naming her great-grandfather who disappeared in the war. It wasn't magic. It was memory finally released. The mansion held echoes, of screams, of lullabies, of farewells, and now it was letting them out. One morning, as dawn broke gently over the estate, a visitor arrived. But no car pulled up, no footsteps on gravel, only a gust of warm wind, and the rustle of ancestral trees. The girl stood barefoot in the garden watching, and slowly across the lawn they came, the dead. But they did not arrive in terror. They came with kindness, with quiet eyes, with glowing skin, with the scent of river leaves and burnt wood. They came not to haunt, but to thank. That night, guests sleeping in the mansion reported dreams unlike any other. A widow dreamed her great-grandmother brushed her hair and told her she was not alone. A mute child woke up crying tears and speaking the name of her father for the first time. Even the billionaire, once so skeptical of the unseen, dreamed of a man in chains smiling and saying, "Now we rest." The girl did not speak of these things. She simply walked the halls, lighting lamps, watering plants, listening to the walls. Because in that silence, the mansion had become alive. It breathed, remembered, and it loved. On the 7th week after the shrine opened, the girl gathered everyone in the courtyard. There was no invitation, no flyer, just a bell. And they came, every soul the mansion had healed. The courtyard was quiet. The stars above were brighter than any chandelier. And then the girl took out a scroll, not made of paper, but of cloth. Old Kent cloth with stitched names, names not from history books, but from dream visitations, whispered memories, and ancestral prayers. And she called out each one by one. and for each name a lantern was lit. Until the mansion glowed not with electricity but with memory. The land responded. Wild dogs that once prowled in fear now lay peacefully under the trees. Cattle passed and bowed their heads. Birds nested by the dozen. Even bees built hives near the shrine, protecting it like sacred guards. Because even animals feel when the air becomes sacred. Even animals know when the land has healed. There was no clock in the mansion anymore. No alarms. No business meetings. No schedules. People came to stay for one night and remained for months. Not because they were trapped, but because they were home. And the girl, once a beggar on the street, now walked through the halls like a priestess. Her feet never tired. Her hands always open. Her eyes always seeing the unseen. And the billionaire? He followed. Not to lead, not to manage, but to learn, to unlearn, and to honor. The mansion was no longer known by its colonial name. It had no address on the map, but people found it because when the soul seeks healing, the road appears. And somewhere between heaven and history, this mansion stood, as a bridge, between what was taken and what is returned, between the forgotten and the remembered, between silence and song. And the dead, they kept coming, not to stay, but to witness, to say, "Thank you. You did not forget." There are houses that carry beauty. There are houses that carry wealth. And then there are houses that carry memory. This mansion, the one raised by pain, restored by love, and blessed by forgotten spirits, became more than a structure of brick and marble. It became a soul, a breathing presence that would now open its arms to the ones the world had cast aside. And so begins the next chapter in her story. It started quietly. One rainy morning, a boy arrived at the gate. His feet were bare, his eyes blank. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The girl, who had once sat on the streets herself, unwanted and invisible, simply opened the door. She showed him to a room with no mirrors, no clocks, just warmth, blankets, and silence. The boy slept for 2 days straight. When he awoke, he wept, not out of sorrow, but because for the first time in years, his body had rested where his soul felt safe. After him came others, a widow with lost memory, a child who hadn't spoken since her village burned, a man who had lived in a cardboard box since 1998. They didn't find the mansion found them. Because now it was more than a house, it was a home for the haunted. The broken came not in limousines but in whispers, not in convoys but in dreams. Some had heard of a place where the wind told stories, where your dead grandmother visited you in your sleep, where birds sang your name and mirrors reflected not your face, but your ancestors. And so they came, with nothing but pain, with nothing but silence. And each time the girl welcomed them, not with speeches or sermons, but with space. Space to rest, to remember, to unravel. She said nothing, because healing does not begin with noise, it begins with presence. One chamber in the house had been transformed. The walls were now woven in raffia mats, and the floor was laid with red earth. In its center stood a bowl of water, undisturbed. Above it, wind chimes made of cowries and ancestral bones. It became known, by no official name, as the Room of Returning. No one was told what to do in it, but those who entered emerged different. They'd come in with trembling hands and leave with memories they never knew they carried. A woman entered and remembered the lullaby her mother sang before being taken on a slave ship. A boy walked in silent, and walked out screaming the names of ancestors buried in mass graves. They called it supernatural, but truly it was memory awakening. The house itself had become an oracle, its walls a shrine, its floors sacred earth. Then one night it happened. No thunder, no lightning, just stillness. The air grew heavier, like the space between a heartbeat and a tear. And then they came, not with chains, not with wails, but with grace. The dead, the forgotten, the enslaved, the silenced. Spirits cloaked in white mist glided across the garden barefoot. Some held seeds, some held drums, some carried only silence, but all carried love. They walked among the guests, touched foreheads, whispered in dreams, sat beside sleeping children. Not one person woke up in fear, because every soul knew these were not ghosts. They were family finally returned. Days later, the girl stood in the courtyard. Around her stood the guests, now no longer broken but becoming. In her arms she carried a large piece of cloth, Worn, hand-woven, the colors faded from generations of use. Upon it were stitched names, names no one knew how she'd found. Names erased from history books. Names chanted in dreams. Names recovered from rivers and ruins and bones. She held a lantern in her hand. For every name she lit a flame, one after another. And with each light the wind grew gentler, the garden brighter, and the night warmer. It became clear, this was no longer her house. It was ours. A resting place for every soul who had been tossed aside by empire, by history, by silence. The land responded. Birds that had not nested for decades came in flocks, perching on the branches of ancestral trees. Wild dogs once hostile now lay peacefully at the shrine's feet. Bees formed hives near the rooftop, producing honey so sweet that even the sick regained strength with a spoonful. Even a white crane, a rare bird known in local myth as the Watcher of Ancestors, was seen walking near the gates one dawn. The girl never questioned it. She knew. Even the animals feel sacredness when it arrives. Even the land knows when home has returned. No one tracked time anymore. Guests who came to stay a week remained for years. Some never left. Some died peacefully in their sleep, buried under mango trees with blessings sung over them. The house had no clocks. Only seasons. Only stories. People began bringing their dead there, not for burial but for blessing. Because to die in the presence of that house was to return whole. To be remembered. To not be lost. And where was he? The man whose name once echoed in corporate towers? He was still there. No longer a CEO. No longer a host. But a student. He watched her walk the halls barefoot, smiling at walls, whispering to plants. He'd never seen such peace. She spoke to the air like it was alive. And maybe it was. He had brought her in to save her. But now he realized she had saved him. The mansion once bore a name given by colonizers. A name etched in stone. A name that meant nothing to the soil it sat on. But now a new name emerged, not printed but sung. Ekumiku Afo. The place where the lost become found. Guests began calling it that, and soon the world did too. The rich came asking for invitations. She refused them all. This was not a business. It was a living shrine. And only the truly broken, the truly ready could be found by it. In Africa we say, the land remembers who watered it and who bled into it. So when the sons of men come with deeds and threats, forgetting the blood beneath their feet, they often awaken things they cannot silence. And on this day, the land spoke. But first it was quiet. They came in black SUVs wearing suits too tight for humility. The billionaire's brothers. His sisters. His father's old business partners. Their eyes scanned the estate like hawks hovering over prey. One said, "This place is worth millions." And he gave it to a beggar girl? Another laughed. She turned it into a spiritual rehab. What nonsense. They brought lawyers. They brought documents. They brought a plan to take everything back. Because to them, the mansion was not a memory, not a soul, not sacred. It was a line on a balance sheet. But they had forgotten. The girl they came to destroy was no longer just a girl. She was part of the soil now. They tried to evict her. Claimed she bewitched him. Claimed she stole the house. Claimed she was unqualified, uneducated, unstable. They filed motions. Flew in judges. Even tried to bribe local chiefs to side with them. The guests were terrified. The broken ones who had finally found peace, now threatened with exile. And through it all the girl said nothing. She simply sat beneath the sacred baobab tree, her palms pressed to the earth, listening. Not to the lawyers, not to the shouting, but to the land. Because land speaks, not in words but in signs. And the signs were coming. That night something strange happened. The newly installed security lights around the estate shut off. All of them. Not due to power failure. The generators worked fine. The estate had solar backups. But still, darkness fell. Then winds. Not violent. Not destructive. But purposeful. They howled in a language no man had spoken in 300 years. They circled the mansion 3 times. And then, silence. The billionaire's brothers laughed. Superstitious nonsense, they said. But one lawyer refused to return the next day. He said he saw a face in the wind. A woman with eyes like burning coals. A woman who looked exactly like their great-grandmother, the one their family never spoke of because she had been a slave. 2 days later, the documents to seize the land were delivered. As the court officers stepped into the compound, the papers caught fire. Not from matches, not from sunlight. The flames rose without cause, burning bright but silent. They did not spread. They only burned the papers. The court officials dropped them and fled. The ashes spelled something in an old dialect. The guests couldn't read it, but the girl could. You cannot repossess what was never yours. They tried again. This time they came with more men. Armed officers, bulldozers, court orders, news reporters. But blocking the estate's front gate was an elephant. A full-grown bull elephant. Silent, unmoving, majestic. It didn't rage. It didn't run. It just stood, watching. No one knew where it came from. There were no wildlife reserves nearby. No zoos. No escaped animals. And yet, there it was. The officer leading the operation tried to force it away. Took one step toward it. The elephant let out a sound so deep, it cracked the windshield of the nearest SUV. No one tried again. That night, the elephant disappeared. No one saw it leave. At last, the billionaire gathered his family in the courtyard. He said nothing at first. Just stood beside her, the girl he had once taken in. Then he spoke. "This is not my house. It never was. It belonged to those we buried in silence. Those we stole from. Those we erased. She did not steal this land. She healed it." The family sneered, called him bewitched. But then the ground began to shake. Not violently, but like a heartbeat. The grass shimmered. The trees bowed. And a voice, neither man nor woman, rose from the soil. "She is the first to ask permission. You are the last to be warned." The family never returned. Not because they were afraid, but because they were forgotten. Years passed. No record of their lawsuits. No trace of their legal claims. Even the properties they owned began to collapse. Walls growing mold, ceilings falling. It was as if the land had rejected their names. The estate, however, flourished. Now officially registered in her name. Not by court ruling, but by communal decree. The town elders, the youth leaders, the spiritual seers, declared the mansion sacred ground. Untouchable. Unstealable. Eternal. And on one quiet morning, she placed a sign at the estate's gate. Read, "This land was not given to me. It remembered me,